Hello and welcome to Neurosurgery Written Board Crash Course, and this is part 2 of the basal ganglia video. In part 1, we went over the basal ganglia circuitry, and now let's delve into the more specifics of each structure. And this slide is just here to remind everybody of the basal ganglia components. So first let's go over the caudate. The caudate has a few components, namely they're the head, the body, and that it swings around to become the tail. There are a few things to note here, is that anteriorly around the head of the caudate, it is contiguous with the putamen. And also anterior to the caudate head, where the caudate and the putamen meet anteriorly, you will find the nucleus accumbens. Posteriorly, the tail of the caudate is contiguous with the amygdala. So looking at it from another view, on the mid-coronal view, anteriorly, you will find, as we talked about, the nucleus accumbens, as well as the anterior perforated substance, where the lenticular vessels come in from the base of the brain to supply the basal ganglia. And around the body of the caudate body is separated from the thalamus by the two structures, the striae terminalis and the Thalamostriate vein. And the Thalamostriate vein is also called the terminal vein. And note that the striae terminalis is not the same as the striae medullaris, and we've covered the difference between the two structures in the epithalamus videos. The caudate, as we talked about then, turns around to form the tail, and the tail then terminates in the amygdala. And the tail also sits on the roof of the temporal horn over here near the amygdala. And we've covered the temporal horn in the hippocampus video. So the striatum has many inputs and outputs, and they're mostly involved in the motor pathways and the basal ganglia pathways, as covered in the previous part. And as a result, the most important input and output structures has to include things like the motor cortex, substantia nigra, and thalamus. And more particularly, the primary input is the corticostriate fibers conducting information from the cortex to the striatum. There is also communication from the thalamus to the striatum, as we covered in the thalamus videos. The central median nucleus goes to the putamen, and the parafascicular nucleus goes to the caudate. And overall, the fibers are carried by the thalamostriate fibers, that's listed here. There is also the nigrostriatal fibers that contributes the direct and indirect pathways of the substantia nigra fibers. There is also communication between the amygdala and the raphe nucleus, which are not labeled, not shown in this figure. And in terms of the output, most of these fibers are in the basal ganglia circuitry. And so the primary output is the Striatopallidal fibers that contributes the fibers in the direct and indirect pathways. There is also the Striatonigral fibers that is pretty much a reciprocal connection between the substantia nigra and the striatum. And there is also a connection between the substantia nigra and the thalamus, which are not labeled here. Before I move on to the globus pallidus, I just wanted to say a few words on a set of structures that separates the lentiform nucleus, and it's called the medullary lamina. The lateral medullary lamina separates the putamen from the globus pallidus externus, and the medial medullary lamina separates the globus pallidus externus from the globus pallidus internus. And there is another structure not as important as the accessory medullary lamina, which separates or divides the globus pallidus internus into an inner and outer segment. And you probably may find the name medullary lamina familiar because the same name is also used in the thalamus. And don't confuse the two structures because they mean completely two different things. And you can check out the thalamic video for more information on the thalamic medullary lamina. So the globus pallidus has many inputs and outputs. And in terms of the globus pallidus inputs, remember in the basal ganglia pathway, we talked about two structures that goes into the globus pallidus, namely the striatum in the direct pathway and the subthalamic nucleus in the indirect pathway. And so the two sets of fibers that carries these information is called Striatopallidal fibers that carries from the striatum to the globus pallidus, and also the subthalamic fasciculus that carries information from the subthalamic nucleus to the globus pallidus. And those two systems are illustrated in this figure here, the striatopallidal fibers and the subthalamic pallidal fibers, which is the subthalamic fasciculus. Before we go into the output system for the globus pallidus, we have to go over what is known as the field of Forel fibers. These are a bunch of fibers in an area below the thalamus and consist of three defined white matter areas of the subthalamus. The first is an area, a fiber called Ansa lenticularis, noted here. These fibers travels from the globus pallidus internus, and it loops under the posterior limb of the internal capsule. This is the posterior limb of the internal capsule here. And it loops around to travel under the thalamus to join other fibers and eventually becomes the thalamic fasciculus. And this structure is named Ansa because Ansa is Latin for a loop. And these fibers eventually goes to join to structures in the thalamus, such as the central median nucleus, the VA-VL nucleus. Next structure is called the lenticular fasciculus, over here. These fibers travels from the globus pallidus internus and passes through the internal capsule and travels on top of the subthalamic nucleus here before they loop dorsally and rostrally towards the VA-VL. And the lenticular fasciculus then joins the Ansa lenticularis to become the thalamic fasciculus. Notice that when the lenticular fasciculus loops dorsally, it loops around the structure called the zona incerta. And so as a result, the Forel's field 2 is synonymous with the lenticular fasciculus, and it is made up of projections from the pallidum, the globus pallidus, to the thalamus. The thalamic fasciculus is also known as the field, Forel's field H1, is a combination of 3 different fibers. As we talked about before, the Ansa lenticularis and the lenticular fasciculus is 2 of them, and the third one is the cerebellothalamic tracts, and more specifically is the dentatothalamic tracts. And we'll cover the input from the cerebellum in the cerebellum videos. Now, the H1, Forel's field 1 and Forel's fields 2 are separated by a structure called the zona incerta. And we don't know really too much about the structure, and it's not very important other than the fact that it's where it's anatomically located. And note that there is also another structure called the subthalamic fasciculus that conveys reciprocal information between the subthalamic nucleus and the globus pallidus. So now we can go back to the output systems of the globus pallidus. The output fibers are of the globus pallidus is called pallidofugal fibers. Fugal meaning away, centrifugal, right? And these fibers are solely GABAergic neurons that are tonically active. And as we talked about in the last slide, the major output system of the globus pallidus are the Forel's field fibers, the Ansa lenticularis, the lenticular fasciculus, and the thalamic fasciculus. There are 2 other fibers that also conveys output fibers from the globus pallidus, and namely they're the Pallidotegmental and the Pallidosubthalamic. The Pallidotegmental fibers carries information from the globus pallidus internus via the Forel's field fibers, and it terminates in the pedunculopontine nucleus in the inferior tegmentum of the midbrain. And the pedunculopontine nucleus, which is PPN for short, is a nucleus of the reticular formation and is associated with reticulospinal tract cells. And we'll cover those in the brainstem videos. The Pallidosubthalamic nucleus conveys information between the globus pallidus to the subthalamic nucleus, and also the globus pallidus internus conveys information via the stria medullaris to the lateral habenulum. Also via this is considered part of the Pallidosubthalamic system. So moving on to the subthalamus, this structure is located posterior laterally to the hypothalamus, and as the name suggests, it is inferior, ventral, to the thalamus, and medial to the internal capsule. And this region actually has quite a few components, and the most commonly known component is obviously the subthalamic nucleus. There is also one more gray matter between the thalamic and lenticular fasciculus, and it's called the zona incerta. This structure laterally is continuous with the thalamic reticular nucleus. And we covered that structure, the thalamic reticular nucleus, in the thalamic thalamus video. And as we covered in the previous slides, we don't really know too much about the function, so it's not very important. You just know where it is and its anatomical importance to the Forel field fibers. There are, in the subthalamus, a few important white matter tracts, namely for the most part, the Forel field fibers that we covered in the previous slides, as well as a few other white matter tracts, subthalamic fasciculus, which carries the Pallidosubthalamic and subthalamopallidal fibers, which conveys reciprocal fibers between the subthalamus, subthalamic nucleus, and the globus pallidus. And also there are fibers of the sensory fasciculi, which includes medial lemniscus, the spinal thalamic and trigeminal thalamic tracts to the ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial nucleus of the thalamus, which basically carries the sensory information. So I've listed here all the inputs and outputs of the subthalamus, and it's not important to memorize every single component, but to get a general gestalt feeling of what the components are. And because the subthalamus, the subthalamic nucleus, as we covered before, is involved heavily in the basal ganglia circuitry, it is only reasonable to assume that most of the fibers that goes in and out of the subthalamus are the basal ganglia circuitry. And so, as we talked about before, the subthalamus has input from the globus pallidus externus and has output to the globus pallidus internus over here. And there are obviously reciprocal connections between the globus pallidus externus. And there are also other modulatory signals to the subthalamus, or between the subthalamus and other structures such as the motor cortex and the central median parafasciculus nucleus of the thalamus. And the neurotransmitter, as we talked about before, is excitatory neurotransmitter. In this case, is a glutamate. And just briefly on the Substantia nigra, we'll have more on this topic in the brainstem videos. The Substantia nigra is separated into two components, namely the Substantia nigra pars compacta and the Substantia nigra pars reticulata. The pars compacta is more medial and more on the inside than the pars reticulata. And the pars compacta is named so because it's got more compact neurons than the pars reticulata. But the pars reticulata cells are pigmented, and the pigment is created by the neuromelanin. The neurotransmitters used by the two parts are different as well. The pars compacta is the dopaminergic system that contributes to that controls the direct and indirect pathways, and the pars reticulata uses the GABA system. And remember that we said that for all intents and purposes, we can lump together the globus pallidus internus together with the Substantia nigra pars reticulata system, and that is also reflected here because both structures uses the same neurotransmitter, which are inhibitory neurons. And so, as we talked before, the Substantia nigra pars compacta participates in the basal ganglia circuitry. And this is part 2 of the basal ganglia video. I hope you find this helpful, and we'll see you next time.